The second one was the question about Jammu and Kashmir and Hindu-Muslim relations. You see, you can extract India-Pakistan relations from India-Pakistan relations, a number of factors which appear to be drivers. The first is this issue of identity. Is that a driver in India-Pakistan relations? I think it is a driver to some extent in Pakistan, to a lesser extent than in India. Why is it such a driver in Pakistan? Because I think the answer lies not so much in the Hindu-Muslim polarity as in the burden which a successor state carries. You see, one tends to overlook the fact that Pakistan is a successor state. Pakistan is the breakaway state. It's not the successor state. So there's a burden on the breakaway state which the successor state does not carry. And when you live in Islamabad or when you live in Pakistan, what you realize is that if you look at India-Pakistan relations through a narrow prism of the geopolitical issues involved, you tend to forget how much of a hegemonic role India has in Pakistan. And in social terms, in cultural terms, and in intellectual terms, you have a very, very, maybe hegemonic is the wrong word to use, but it is the closest that I can think of. But you are in many ways a kind of cultural hegemon in Pakistan. So I won't see it in terms of Hindu-Muslim issues. I would see it in terms of the complexes which a breakaway state has towards a hegemonic power in its neighborhood. I think that is certainly a driver in India-Pakistan relations. Maybe the identity issues, maybe the Hindu-Muslim issues play a role, but I think that role has been coming down regularly over the years. I think that is a role, that is a factor which we in India, because of our own domestic disputes and domestic contestations and domestic debates, we try to transplant onto the India-Pakistan interface. But I don't think it actually exists in the way people imagine it to. The second is the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. You're quite right. I think Jammu and Kashmir is a major factor. There's no denying it. K in Pakistan, after all, stands for Kashmir. And most Pakistanis feel that Kashmir is the final part of the partition, of the division of the subcontinent, and it is yet to be completed. Yes, I think it is a major factor. You can't escape from that. But that is a factor which has been there for a long time. And the question is, how do you deal with that issue? I think this Article 370, the internal legislative changes made last year, those are not fundamental. Pakistan, after all, never gave any importance to Article 370 till it was finally done away with or hollowed out. Pakistan never recognized the independent state of Jammu and Kashmir, or it never recognized the status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir in India. So the fact that it is giving importance to that from a state it's become a union territory and their autonomy has been taken away, these were factors it never gave any importance to. In the past, Pakistan was quite happy dealing with numerous chief ministers of India. The one chief minister they would never break any bread with was the chief minister of Jammu and Kashmir. So why is there this sudden... so I don't think that is a fundamental factor. Yes, Jammu and Kashmir is a factor. What happened last year is only symptomatic. If you decide to move forward or you find a framework to move forward, I don't think what has happened last year is going to get in the way. But you have to find that larger framework which makes it possible for both to move forward.
Okay, now we'll take some questions which have come. from our fellows. The first question has come from Professor Chahal, and he asks, when people from both sides have the same genes, why should the genetic factor be so important?
Well, in my view, there's no genetic factor. Some people say that there is a DNA issue, that you can't expect anything different from India-Pakistan relations because of the way genes are configured. But I don't believe in that. In my view, there is no genetic factor which predisposes India and Pakistan to have such a poor relationship. You have political issues, you have diplomatic issues, you have a host of unresolved differences, but there's nothing. These are part of most of many neighboring country relationships. There's nothing specifically unique to India and Pakistan about this. So, in brief, I don't think there's any. I said there are people who believe that there is a predisposition in India and Pakistan which makes for a bad relationship. I don't agree with that.
Exactly. In other words, just as Germany and Britain were the worst of enemies and now they're good friends, we can also have good neighborly relations sometime in the foreseeable future. Anyhow, that brings me to the second question, which is exactly about this neighborly relations from Professor Rajvi Sharma. And it says that if you have an Asuri neighbor in Pakistan, then how do you build good relations? So your talk did touch a number of issues from terrorism to environmental and human security, riparian issues, the water issues. So, of course, we have so many reasons to mend our fences, as it were. But when you have, as he puts it, an Asuri neighbor, then isn't there a structural problem in improving our relationship? That's the question.
No, clearly there are structural problems, and clearly in the period since 1989, there has been an extent of Pakistan provocation, which would seriously destabilize any relationship. My point is, having said that, uh, uh, is there scope for moving forward? I would say yes. And one can go into the details of it. But more than anything else, you have no other option than going forward. Because the question is not whether you are doing so for the sake of good neighborly relations or for the sake of some kind of a mythical cultural commonality or civilizational commonality that you share. That's not the question. The question is whether it's in your interest or not. I mean, from a geopolitical point of view, it is entirely in your interest that your neighborhood is stable.
Yeah, again, we missed about 30 seconds. You said the question is not, and then we lost you for 30 seconds. The question is not.
The question is not whether you are doing this for the sake of good neighborly relations or because you believe that there is some cultural commonality which means that there is a reservoir of goodwill which you can tap. No, those are not the issues. You are trying to optimize your relationship because it is in your interests. It's in your national interest to do so. It's not in your national interest that you have a highly securitized, unstable relationship with the immediate neighbor. It's not good for your economy. It's not good for your overall profile. And plus, it's a dangerous situation that you have an historically adversarial relationship with a nuclear power which is internally unstable, that you should leave it like that and proceed on the basis that there is no option but for this relationship to be bad, it's not in your interests. So you have to act as per your interests.
Let's just take another question. This is from Dr. Subramanyam. He says, what is the potential of tourism pilgrimage in opening up non-security niches, also people to people contact? Now, I must say that in your book, you talked about this whole Aman Ki Asha initiative and how it came out of copper. So the question can be further refined to ask how it is that this pilgrimage and Kartarpur corridor can change that earlier people-to-people track too, which ultimately, didn't succeed as well as people had hoped.
You see, I think people to people contacts and tourism and pilgrimages are important in themselves. But we shouldn't expect these initiatives to move mountains. More pilgrimages in both directions will not mean that your political relationship will improve. It is helpful, yes, but I don't think one can put so much of a, you can't expect people to people initiatives to transform deeply adversarial relations. To do that, you have to address the political issues involved. But, one should also recognize how the impact of these people to people and tourism and pilgrimages, how the impact of that is, in fact, very region specific in India. Views about Pakistan and Punjab are quite different from views about Pakistan in Tamil Nadu. Views about Pakistan in Rajasthan are quite different from views in Karnataka. Those states which are closer in physical terms to Pakistan have a different perspective because naturally they are in the front line of the downside, of the impact of the downside when relations are not good. If you in Pakistan, in Punjab, for instance, there is a pretty big community. There's a pretty big constituency in support of improvement of relations, which you will not find elsewhere in the country because in Punjab, in particular, a lot of tourism, a lot of services, a lot of trade, in fact, stands to benefit if relations eased between India and Pakistan. And a lot of the push, for instance, from the Kartarpur corridor came from there. So I don't think one should underestimate the impact of this at the regional or sub-regional level. But I think at the national level, when one is talking about overall policy, these things like tourism, pilgrimages have some limited role, but we should be on the guard against giving it too much importance. I don't think Aman Ki Asha will transform India-Pakistan relations. You need political initiatives to do.
Well, Dr. Subramanyam has a follow-up question. He's saying that, do you think that making efforts to accept the legitimacy of fact of Pakistan will help being, which implies that a lot of people in India do not accept the legitimacy or the fact of Pakistan, I suppose.
No, I think in India, I don't think there's any issue of that. I don't think there is a view that we don't accept the existence of Pakistan. There is this, there used to be rather this view in Pakistan that India is not reconciled to the division of the subcontinent, and this Akhand Bharat view still holds a lot of weight. But I don't think, I mean, living in India, I don't get that impression. I think people are quite happy with the borders that they are. There may be a few in the fringe who feel that all this can be changed. But I think the mainstream view is that we have to live with the borders that we have.
In fact, some people, even, in the Hindutva circles, if one might say so, actually feel that the partition was a blessing in disguise because there's a theory that the demographic should I say, threat would have been much greater if we had 30% instead of 12% to deal with, like Lebanon. But we leave that aside. Here's another question. What is your opinion? This is from Dr. Anjali Duhan. What is your opinion on the restricted people to people contact, which creates ambiguities between the masses? When people from both nationalities meet in any of the Western countries, they often become the best of friends.
Well, it is true that if you leave politics out of it, uh, Indians and Pakistanis are the best of friends, and therefore, in neutral platforms, you hear this constantly from students that my best friend is a Pakistani. Uh, when I was High Commissioner in Pakistan, I used to be deluged with requests for visas from young Pakistani men and women who wanted to travel to India to attend a college friend's wedding or engagement. Yes, there is that cultural commonality. And I think it is important for its own sake. It is important in itself. And certainly we should do what we can to foster it. The current situation is quite exceptional in India Pakistan relations, that there's almost no people to people contact right now. And I think we should try to remedy that as soon as we can. Uh, so it is important in itself. My point simply is that I don't think we should expect this cultural commonality to lead to political change. I think we have to, given the background of the past 70 years, we should be prepared to admit that there are deeply held Pakistani positions on many issues, just like there are equally strong Indian positions on those issues. And both positions are far apart. It's a very difficult job to try to bridge this gap. But we need to recognize that there is an actual problem, and that there are these differences in positions on a whole range of issues. So we can't just paper over it by stressing on the fact that we enjoy the same literature, listen to the same music, go to the same films, and so on. Because I mean, I attend a lot of these India-Pakistan discussions and interactions, and you find those discussions are wonderful and really heartwarming. But there is a kind of a unspoken tacit agreement on both sides that you won't go into controversial issues. I think discussions become meaningful only when you go into controversial issues.
I think that's a brilliantly put point. Discussions become meaningful only when you go into controversial points. I suppose, it applies not only to neighbors, but also families, even husband and wife. But anyhow, the last question is to Professor C.K. Raju. And as usual, he will voice it his own way, not through a message. He hasn't sent us a message. So go ahead, Professor Raju, unmute your mic, and I'm muting mine. Go ahead.
Thank you. As I was saying, I think there are a lot of other mics which are on. As I was saying, I think you did not touch upon some very critical issues. And let us see, why did the Gujarat initiative fail? Or why did the Vajpayee initiative fail? See, it was based on a sort of nostalgia. These people were from Lahore. Lahore was a big center, and they had this nostalgia. Yes, we can get together and so on. All you have to do is extend a hand of friendship. But I think that the critical issue, one of the critical issues, is the economic failure, complete economic failure of Pakistan. You travel anywhere abroad, you see so many people coming from Pakistan. And they come, you ask them, why are you coming here? Why are you living this kind of a wretched life? There is nothing to do back home. There is no electricity, no water, no factories, nothing. So there's a total failure of the economy. Now, the other thing is that this failure of the economy made the army so large. But that has changed. The army was a very critical component of Pakistan once upon a time, but now there is a very strong religious component. And the second thing is that once upon a time, it was always the Western my Bap who was playing the game between both the people. And now there is a completely different entry from the side of China. So I think that we have to look at these structural changes that today Imran Khan is very shaky because it's not just the army alone, but there is also a very strong religious background. Their religious leadership that has changed. And the second thing that has changed is that it is no longer Uncle Sam who's sitting on top, but it is China who's sitting there, which is going to make any negotiation almost impossible because the kind of thing that has been done, the kind of corridor that has been established in order to get oil and so on. So I think that those are issues, those are structural issues which are changing. And apart from Kashmir and so on, those are the issues, not the nostalgia, not the kind of political initiative that Gujral and Vajpayee visualized, which is going to make a change. I think we have to contend with them. And you said nothing about it. How do you propose to contend?
Firstly, I disagree with the view that Vajpayee or Gujral or Manmohan Singh acted out of nostalgia. Vajpayee, of course, was not from Lahore or Punjab, but Gujral and Manmohan Singh certainly were. And in their, from the way they spoke and often what they wrote, it did appear that what was driving them was some kind of nostalgia for the past when they were both in Government College Lahore and they loved walking through the mall. But in fact, I don't think that is the case. I think they were as hard-headed as any person who becomes Prime Minister of India is. You know, you don't become Prime Minister of India just like anything. So I don't think their policy was nostalgic. Just like I don't think that Prime Minister Modi's policy is only geared towards optical positions. No, it is driven by an understanding of what is your national interest. So I think it's not nostalgia. It is a question of, I mean, a lot of what Vajpayee did was informed by the fact that India was now a nuclear power and Pakistan had also become a nuclear power. I think that was the fundamental challenge he was trying to address, that the situation in South Asia had changed. It had become a nuclearized region. And you could not deal with Pakistan in the old way. You had to find a new frame. I think that was the main attempt behind his Lahore bus visit. I don't think one should mix up the optics with the substance. The optics are there to make sure that that the public narrative is supportive of your substantive move. But optics are not an end in themselves. So I think a lot of what Prime Minister Vajpayee did was because of May 1998, that you had become a nuclear weapon state. Pakistan was a nuclear weapon state. You had to find a new framework. And it was quite a hard-headed, I think a lot of what Gujral did or what Gujral embarked upon was in the context of what was happening in the early and mid-1990s. I think we have forgotten what the mid-1990s and the early 1990s were for India. You were suddenly faced with a world which was unipolar. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1992. There was a major insurgency underway in Kashmir. There was a huge amount of pressure coming on you from the United States. It was not China at that time. You know, China was still inward looking because of Tiananmen Square and so on. The pressure at that time was from the United States. I think that was the context he was really trying to respond to. And it was not just him, also Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. So we can't, pretend that they were dealing with the situation where you have certain strengths today which were not available to them then. I think they had a particular set of issues which they had to resolve, and they were trying to resolve them in the country's interest in a pretty hard-headed way. I don't think it was nostalgia. or if there was nostalgia, it was a very small element in the total policy input. The second point about China. Yes, it is true, and I think I mentioned it, that there is a China-Pakistan concert. But we have to deal with this. We cannot just term it as something malignant. It is natural that there will be a China-Pakistan concert. Pakistan is a smaller neighbor next to you, with which you have a history of adversarial relations. They will try to balance you by bringing in bigger powers. They tried it for 40 years with the United States. The United States' role in South Asia was always at Pakistan's behest to balance India. And then, following the deterioration in Pakistan-US relations, they are doing it with China. So there's no point saying that this is something malignant. It is something which you have to deal with. This is what diplomacy and geopolitics is all about. And dealing with it means that you rely on diplomacy as the first means of defense. Yes, you have problems with China, you have problems with Pakistan, but every problem doesn't mean that you see only security-related solutions. I think for a country like India, the first line of defense has to be diplomacy. And the more you rely on diplomatic and political means, the better it is in your national interest.
You didn't answer my third point, that there is a shift in Pakistan, within Pakistan, from the military to religious concerns, to a religious leadership, to a dogmatic leadership.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't answer that. I don't agree with that. I think there is a particular space which conservative and religious elements in Pakistan have always had. But I'm not sure whether that space has increased very dramatically. I think analysts in India tend to make too much about that space. Because if you see in the last 25 years, for instance, it's not as if the religious parties have done any better in the elections which have taken place. By and large, their share of the total voting has been roughly about the same 4-5%, never more than that. I think religious parties have a certain potential for mobilizing supporters on single issues and bringing and having a certain street power. But I don't think that street power has increased. It's also one of those myths which we repeat to ourselves often enough and then start believing ourselves. I mean, for a long time, there was this view about Zia's generals grabbing hold of nuclear weapons. Actually, the Pakistani army, the Pakistani military is even more worried about Zia's offshoots than anyone else is. And they will make sure that they never get into positions of authority. And when they do, they are weeded out quite quickly. I think it's impossible.
Sir, we can't hear you. We are not able to hear you. Your mic is muted. Okay, now. Yeah.
I think we tend to exaggerate the role of the religious elements. They have a certain influence, but I don't think it has the kind of role which we often imagine it to have. Most of the time, the religious parties in Pakistan have not acted as an autonomous force. They have once or twice, but most of the time they have never acted as an autonomous force. They have really been instruments of the Pakistan military. So the real power is held in some other place, not in the religious parties. And it is not as if the religious parties have expanded to such an extent that they are now calling the shots. No. I think they've always had a certain amount of influence, which has enabled them to be useful instruments, sometimes of the military, sometimes of the mainstream political parties, but they have not been a kind of force which we often hear. It's not as if, it's not as if the jihadis are deciding policy in Pakistan. No. The problem with Pakistan is that jihadis are being used as instruments of state policy. not that they are deciding policy.
Thank you.